Dr. Susan Colbourn is Associate Director of the Program in American Grand Strategy and Associate Research Professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. She was trained in Diplomatic and International History at the University of Toronto, where she received her PhD in 2018. And she holds an MA from the London School of Economics and a BA from Trinity College at the University of Toronto. I've known Susie more than 13 years, actually, since we both participated in an archival workshop in Washington, D.C., back when both of us were working on dissertations. And then we also overlapped at the University of Toronto, where we worked together in the same research workshop with the great historian of the Soviet Union, Lynn Viola. Susie's book, which some of which has come out of that workshop and her work at the University of Toronto, is Euromissiles, the nuclear weapons that nearly destroyed NATO. And that was published by Cornell University Press and is the subject of today's talk. And while the Euromissiles crisis may not be particularly well remembered today, this episode in transatlantic relations posed a severe political challenge to NATO, and it came at a time of heightened Cold War tensions in the early 1980s. And so Dr. Colbourn's book is timely and encourages us to better understand the international and internal dynamics that shaped the alliance's policies then and today. And while quite separate from the European Union, NATO and EU institutions have historically been intimately intertwined as Europe experienced the Cold War and the post-Cold War worlds. Concerned simultaneously to preserve stability on the continent, provide for its own security, and also embark on an ambitious program of political and economic integration. And for this reason, I think the talk has a lot to teach us about the international environment in the 1980s, with strong implications for today, a time when a major war is ongoing in what is now an EU candidate country. So please join me in welcoming Susan Colbourn.
Thank you so much, Mark-Jan, for the kind introduction and the invitation to be here. It's always a special privilege to do this with close friends who have seen you work and write and unwrite pieces of the long slog to what becomes a book. And I want to thank everyone at the EU Center for the work that they put in to make this happen. And thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. So I'm going to talk, as Mark-Jan said, about my recent book, Euromissiles, which came out just shy of 2 years ago. And the book itself is a transatlantic history of the so-called Euromissiles. And by that, I mean the theater nuclear forces, TNF, or intermediate range nuclear forces, INF, that dominated much of the 1970s and 1980s. I am by training a historian of NATO, so I am steeped in a lot of acronyms. I will do my best to use absolutely none of them except for NATO, which I trust if you're here, you know what that stands for and what I'm talking about. But I will always try to not fall into the acronym-laden jargon of missile rape. So the story that I tell in the book is fundamentally one that revolves around three types of medium-range missiles. On one hand, the Soviet Union's RSD-10 Pioneer, which was more often known by its NATO reporting name, the SS-20 Sabre. On the other side, the US BGM-109G Griffin ground-launched cruise missile, almost always just called the Glickum, and then the US Pershing II ballistic missiles. The history I tell in the book is one that started from a basic premise to answer a seemingly straightforward question. Why did the Euromissiles matter? And so with my time today, I want to talk first briefly about how I came to this project and a little bit of the process researching this book. And then I want to walk through a few of the major episodes and flag a couple of the key takeaways and arguments, and hopefully leave a bit of time for questions at the end. So in many respects, we're at an inflection point in thinking about the Cold War, but particularly the late Cold War. I think this is an inflection point or a shift made possible by two major phenomena. The first is growing access to archival material and records from the 1970s, and particularly from the 1980s. And the other is a generational shift. That sufficient time has passed that a generation of scholars now thinking about and writing about this period do not have firsthand memories of the Cold War, even of moments like this at its end. Many of us, myself included, were young kids when the Berlin Wall came down. And so a critical element for me in this project was to write an accessible account of an immensely complex issue using these recently released archival documents, but to do so in a way that could explain the stakes of the Euromissiles to a generation of readers who might not be immediately or intimately familiar with the underlying dynamics at play, right? So who might not be familiar with the assumptions that underpinned so much of the Cold War as a competition in Europe, and the nuclear arms race between the two superpowers and their respective alliances. I want to say just a few words about how I approached that task. I think typically when we think of the Euromissiles, I guess I should say if we think of the Euromissiles, we tend to think of moments like this one, right? This is Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signing the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in December 1987 that did away with this entire class of missiles, the Euromissiles. But the story is not just, to my mind, one about dramatic change in superpower relations. Just as common were scenes like this one. Here, hundreds of thousands assembled in the then West German capital, Bonn, to oppose NATO's plans to deploy the Glickums and Pershing IIs in Western Europe. Though, as you can see, if your language skills permit it, the opposition was always about more than just the missiles. You can see banners calling for neutrality, for an end to NATO membership, for Spain, which had just agreed to join the alliance in 1982, to potentially reject that new policy choice on the part of their government, right? It was always about more than just the missiles themselves. And so to explain why the Euromissiles mattered, I felt that it was not enough to look at these phenomena in isolation, but rather critical to bring them together, to put these widespread social movements alongside questions of nuclear strategy, superpower diplomacy, and alliance politics. And so in the book, I put NATO at the center of the story. The book draws on archival work from across the Atlantic Alliance in member states both large and small, as well as holdings from the official institutional archives of NATO in Brussels. So I worked in presidential records and prime ministerial papers, along with foreign ministry, defense ministry, and intelligence records in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and a few more. I want to give you one example of what this kind of international research turns out. Here's one characteristically blunt assessment from the French Foreign Ministry archives, making clear that the entire issue of modernizing what were then called theater nuclear forces in the late 1970s, so the US missiles at the heart of the book, was really in large part about the Federal Republic of Germany, right? The Federal Republic of Germany is at the center of the debate, the center of the conversation, the center of the issue. And this is a theme, the centrality of West Germany, that I draw out in a fair bit of detail in the book. I'm happy to talk more in the Q&A about why I think that's so significant. But the use of a multinational source base is not just about providing different perspectives or assessments of a complex alliance with many members, or even about moving beyond treatments focused solely on the largest of the allies, though that is something I care a lot about in the work I do. It's also driven by the realities of doing contemporary history. On sensitive questions like nuclear issues, it's a very, very common sight to see a page like this one, or maybe 10, 15, 20 pages like this one. That's if you're lucky. Sometimes the folder is just empty after you order it with the one withdrawal slip page. And this is totally understandable. Governments are, of course, reluctant to share sensitive information about things like how they planned to use nuclear weapons, when and where they planned to use nuclear weapons. And so even with records dating back 50 years or so, it's not uncommon to see a lot of pages like this one. It's just what language they appear in. Institutional records also weren't enough. to tell the story I wanted to tell. And so I looked for ways to capture the perspectives and arguments put forward by anti-nuclear activists, to understand why and how they mobilized against the Euromissiles. And in part, this was motivated by a desire to move beyond some of the more ideologically inflected charges and polemics levied in the period, where a not insignificant number of people were convinced that the so-called peace movement represented little more than Soviet stooges or useful idiots. And to do this kind of research, the records I used were fundamentally different than the government material or that of NATO that I looked at. I watched nightly news segments and flipped through photographs and pamphlets like this one. I visited archives dedicated to the preservation of anti-nuclear campaigns and other social movements. And you can see here that they preserve a lot of things that tell you a great deal about how anti-nuclear campaigners thought about the Euromissiles in a broader perspective. So this is one pamphlet from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, a British-based organization first founded in the late 1950s. This is from 1986, but you can see a number of places that indicate a high degree of concern about the United States and its power in the world, its power in Europe, and particularly its power in the United Kingdom. So, of course, right? UK airstrip #1 for the USA. If you know anything about the history of World War II, right, this overarmed, overeager over here is a play on common language that was used about American troops stationed, pre-positioned in southern England, waiting for D-Day to happen. And so you can see throughout, right, anxiety, concern, alarm about how powerful the United States was and what that meant for Britain's independence in the world. So the end result of this research is a book that draws on material from 8 countries and over 24 archives, as well as a whole slew of photographs, popular culture, and published media. Now, I think international historians especially can be tempted to fetishize that kind of work, collecting archives for the sake of nothing more than the numbers. But for me, this was an integral way to get at and capture an array of perspectives to tell a long history of the Euromissiles in transatlantic perspective. So after all of this research, what did I have to say about why these Euromissiles matter? I locate the origins of the issues over the Euromissiles in structural elements about NATO as an alliance. The issue, as I see it, was one fundamentally framed by the basic parameters and tensions of the post-war transatlantic bargain, chief among them being the problems of Allied defense. Since the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, the Western Allies had struggled continuously to figure out how to provide a sufficient defense. And I think you can see why when you look at a map like this one from the 1980s. This is produced by NATO itself. Anyone who was designing an alliance from scratch would never pick one shaped like this, right? You would never want your most powerful actor, the United States, the guarantor of everyone else's security, an ocean away. You certainly wouldn't want this to face down an adversary that shares the landmass with most of the countries you're trying to protect. And so unsurprisingly, this geography created a whole host of perennial problems about how the United States could credibly project power and reassure its allies in Canada, in Western Europe, that they would in fact defend the freedom of all of these treaty allies. And so I'm not going to shock anyone who knows anything about NATO's history in this room when I say that extended deterrence, right, this idea of how you project power outwards, was always fraught in the NATO context with recurring bouts of skepticism and anxiety about whether it would actually work. And the story of the Euromissiles is fundamentally no different at its heart. The problems about how to make and preserve a credible extended deterrent appeared time and again. And in the book, I follow these debates from early deliberations in the 1950s about the structure of NATO through the end of the Cold War. So I'm not going to talk about that whole period today. We would be here for much too long. But I want to just tee up a few or flag a few key pieces of the story. I want to turn first to the issue's starting point or origins. The conventional wisdom holds that the entire issue of the Euromissiles, that it began with the Soviet Union's deployment of new missiles, the more advanced SS-20s in the mid-1970s. These weapons were a significant upgrade in Soviet capabilities in the European theater from the early generation of medium and intermediate range missiles. Far fewer of the SS-20s, for instance, had the pesky habit of blowing up on the launch pad because they no longer relied on unstable liquid fuel like the earlier generation of SS-4s and SS-5s had. So in the conventional telling, the Soviet SS-20s posed a fundamentally new threat to Western Europe and forced NATO as an alliance to respond with deployments of its own. NATO's response, we're often told, was spurred by a famous speech delivered by West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, in London in October of 1977. And then this momentum culminates in the alliance's 1979 dual-track decision, which I'll come back to in a moment. But first, I want to suggest that that conventional wisdom is totally wrong. The arrival of the SS-20s did not create a new problem. It added to and exacerbated an already very real and existing problem. The Western Allies, not least the Federal Republic of Germany, were already deeply concerned about the implications of parity, right? A rough equivalence in the size of the nuclear arsenals of the Soviet Union and the United States. And this was made worse by the signing of the first agreement between Moscow and Washington to limit strategic weapons, 1972's SALT I. You can see Nixon and Brezhnev exchanging the protocols here. The West Germans worried that parity would erode the US ability to extend its deterrent to Europe, right? If the superpowers were roughly equivalently matched, then how could the United States use those weapons to both deter a Soviet attack on the American homeland and all the way out to the inner German border? Even after the deployment of the SS-20s, the degree to which these new weapons systems actually posed a risk to NATO was also far from clear in Allied circles. The West German officials were alarmed and worried about a rise of a distinct correlation of forces in Europe, what they increasingly saw as separate from that between the United States and the Soviet Union. And West German analysts and officials started to talk about a Euro-strategic balance, right? That the situation, the overall balance in the continent of Europe was fundamentally different than the global balance. This raised the specter of decoupling, a sort of classic boogeyman in NATO, where officials worried that the United States' ability to protect Western Europe might no longer work. But both the administrations of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter offered repeated assurances to the West Germans and the other Western European allies that these new Soviet missiles did nothing to actually change the overall balance of power. Sure, they might be an upgrade. They might be more effective and blow up less frequently, accidentally, of course. But the United States, the Ford and Carter administrations maintained, had enough power, had enough weaponry in the arsenal to meet this potential threat. Deterrence would hold. So how do we get from there to the decision I told you about a few moments ago in 1979, where NATO decides to deploy new missiles to Western Europe in response, at least publicly stated, to these Soviet SS-20s? The Carter administration shifts position, but ultimately that is the result of another nuclear crisis. The issue, or the crisis over the enhanced radiation warhead, a weapon better known as the neutron bomb. Press leaks in the summer of 1977 had drawn attention to this new anti-tank tactical weapon buried in the budget. And this quickly set off a firestorm and galvanized protesters. It stoked the resurgence of anti-nuclear activism after years in the doldrums. And against mounting public opposition in Western Europe, a fraction of it stoked and bankrolled by Warsaw Pact intelligence services, the NATO allies struggled to cobble together a plan to deploy these new anti-tank systems. That was a painstaking effort to reach an agreement that occupied much of the allies' time over the winter and spring of 1977 and 1978. And then, when the allies were finally on the verge of approving a complex three-part package, Jimmy Carter decided to pull the plug. Carter's decision was roundly criticized. And Carter's choice to walk away was taken as evidence of all the worst things people believed about Jimmy Carter and his administration by the spring of 1978. It was seen as moralistic temporizing and a fundamental lack of leadership on the part of the president. In the press, aides of West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt and his foreign minister and coalition partner, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, mocked the president. They derided him as a religious dreamer, convinced that the Carter administration was, in the words of one West German aide, a leaderless hen coop. Carter, for his part, refused to let members of his administration push back, no matter how often Zbig Brzezinski asked to do so. The cost, at least in Carter's mind, would be too high if it caused even more difficulty in the administration's dealings with Helmut Schmidt's Federal Republic. And for those of you who don't know anything about this, the relationship between these two men, Carter and Schmidt, this was not a friendly dynamic. There was certainly no love lost between these two men. Carter aides described Schmidt as a know-it-all, convinced he would be a better president if only he were eligible for the post. But the political fallout of the neutron bomb made it impossible to ignore West German concerns about the new Soviet SS-20s and the overall viability of NATO's strategy of flexible response. Right, since 1967, the alliance had agreed upon as its core strategy a vision of being able to respond at various different levels of the chain, that you could escalate so that you could make deterrence more effective, right? If you could meet Soviet probing or Soviet activities at various levels of severity, then it might be more effective, or so the basic rationale of flexible response went. It was only in the wake of the neutron bomb fiasco that the Carter administration came around on the need to deploy new missiles to Western Europe. It took the alliance another 18 months to reach an agreement. And what resulted in December 1979 was a complicated arrangement with two main components. It became known as a result by the creative name, the dual-track decision. The first track was to deploy new ground-based missiles to Western Europe. Those are the Glickums and Pershing IIs I mentioned at the beginning. The West Germans were insistent that they could not be alone in shouldering the burden of those deployments. And so, to avoid what they often clunkily called singularization, the decision taken in December 1979 called for deployments to the United Kingdom, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands, in addition to West Germany. The second track was a commitment to undertake or try and undertake arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union in parallel on those same systems, right? To try and negotiate reductions in the Soviet SS-20s still being deployed. This decision was a sort of classic product of alliance wrangling. It expressed a degree of consensus, but virtually no one agreed on the underlying logic or the relationship between the two tracks of this decision. Some saw the deployments as necessary in their own right to shore up the strategy of escalation in flexible response. Others believed that the deployments would be a critical bargaining chip crucial to securing reductions in the Soviet arsenal. So we're much more focused on the arms control side. To reach and approve the dual-track decision in late 1979, the Western Allies simply sidestepped the question. Both of those interpretations coexisted, uncomfortably, but unresolved. If the story I have told you up to this point is one about reassurance as a fundamental motivation for these deployments, the outcome is anything but reassuring, it turns out. The dual-track decision came at a particularly fraught moment in US-Soviet relations in the same month as another major setback, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, just 2 weeks later. And with superpower relations in a free fall, you have a heightened atmosphere of concern that the Cold War is going to become hot again, that the Cold War is back in full force in Europe. This came with mounting fears of nuclear annihilation that define much of the popular culture and zeitgeist of the early 1980s. If we think of many of the most famous pieces of pop culture from that period, there are mushroom clouds everywhere. In War Games, the 1983 film with Matthew Broderick. In Threads, a truly terrifying film that I do not recommend you watch if you haven't watched it before. In 99 Red Balloons, the Nena song, popular in both German and in English. In Stings, right? I hope the Russians love their children too. Even the James Bond movies of the early 1980s revolve around plots where Soviet generals go rogue and steal a nuclear bomb, right? There are mushroom clouds everywhere. These fears are amplified by the election of a new president. Ronald Reagan was seen by many, for better or worse, as an anti-Soviet hawk, willing to talk tough and spend reams of money to defeat the Soviet Union. The president's early rhetoric, and that of many in his administration, added fuel to the fire, leaving many concerned that the Cold War might turn hot. It's not perhaps surprising that when a mid-level Pentagon official goes out and says, everyone can survive a nuclear war, provided there are enough shovels, that most listeners did not find that to be a really comforting piece of advice from the Pentagon. And so these fears are widespread. Take young Elizabeth, for example, a young elementary schooler in Vermont writing to President Reagan in 1982. Please, 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 will you stop nuclear weapons? I want to have fun, but with nuclear war, I wouldn't have fun. I think Elizabeth captures a message that resonated with many. They might have expressed it differently, but the core sentiment was shared by many in the early 1980s. We could see a similar set of concerns in the message put forward by British socialists, right, who saw a generation of conservative politicians all too enamored with the power of deterrence and of nuclear weapons. And so you can see there are clear links between the economic policies of Reagan and Thatcher and their defense policies linked in the critique put forward here. So I don't know how much of it you can read. Obviously this is Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister at the time, based on Gone with the Wind. The text up here, right, says Milton Friedman, in association with Pentagon Productions, presents. The director is Hank Kissinger, right, a reference to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's former national security advisor. The music by Eddie Heath, a reference to one of Thatcher's predecessors as Prime Minister. It is an IMF picture, Right Rank Inc., and then of course the kicker, right? She promised to follow him to the end of the earth. He promised to organize it. There is, I have never been able to verify this, but I was told by a biographer of Reagan that apparently Reagan actually had a copy of this poster in the workshop at the ranch because he loved it so much. But it is certainly in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery in London. And this was fundamentally a message that traveled. So I already showed you this picture, but if you look right here, here's that same poster printed and on a piece of cardboard in the streets of Bonn, right? So these were messages that traveled. Protests rocked Western Europe and North America. These Dutch activists, for instance, took a cruise against crews in the canals of the Netherlands. This widespread popular opposition to nuclear weapons and to NATO's deployments provided ample openings for the Soviet Union and its allies in the Warsaw Pact to try and stop the deployments called for in the dual-track decision. And here is a place where the Allies had done themselves no favors. In December 1979, when they made that decision, they agreed that the deployments would happen 4 years later in 1983. And that time lag created considerable space for the possibility that maybe, somehow, they might be convinced to change their minds. And it was that, of course, pressure that the Warsaw Pact hoped to amplify. And so they invested in homegrown dissent movements, provided funds and carefully calibrated messaging to maximize discontent, conducted information operations, and the like. But I want to be crystal clear. The critics of the Euromissiles came from diverse backgrounds and political traditions, and they opposed the missiles on a variety of grounds. Everything from an understandable fear of nuclear war, to a rejection of the underlying logic of the Cold War, to religious objections about the morality of nuclear deterrence, economic arguments against pouring so much money into the arms race, critiques of nuclear weapons as a fundamentally masculine industry, and the list went on. It was always a large tent movement, and not everyone agreed about basically anything except for the fact that they opposed the Euromissiles. Against this backdrop, the United States and the Soviet Union did begin arms control talks in the fall of 1981 on what were by that point called intermediate range nuclear forces. And if anyone's interested in the change in terminology, I can talk about that in the Q&A, but I won't bore you unless you are genuinely interested. These talks were fundamentally bound up in efforts to win hearts and minds in Western Europe. But because public opinion was so crucial and so important, it meant that those arms control talks were also often dismissed as nothing more than a public relations stunt, right? That they were not actual, genuine attempts to lower the number of nuclear weapons deployed. Despite immense public pressure across much of the alliance between 1979 and 1983, the deployments did end up going ahead in the fall of 1983. And that was the result of votes in favor by the British Parliament, the Italian Parliament, and then finally by the West German Bundestag to accept the missiles. And that was despite scenes like this one. This is Bonn in October 1983, right? Just a month before the Bundestag took the final vote. I want to pause for a moment about just how fragile that decision or that moment was. When I described the dual track decision, I said that there had been a burden sharing of deployment countries so that the West Germans weren't singularized. You'll notice I only listed 3 of the 5 countries that I mentioned there. So both Belgium and the Netherlands at this point had deferred decisions on whether they would deploy to later dates. The West German condition was always that they could not be the only non-nuclear ally on the continent proper to accept nuclear weapons. So for those of you doing that mental math at home, the British don't qualify on 2 counts, right? A nuclear power in their own right, and also not strictly speaking on the continent. And so, to meet the West German conditions, it was entirely up to the Italians. If you know anything about post-war Italian history, relying on the steadiness of Italian politics is a large gamble. luckily, for those at least who supported the dual-track decision, this was one of the most stable periods in post-war Italian politics, and this coalition was particularly strong. But I pause there just to point out how truly lucky, in many respects, it was that they were able to see those deployments through. And then when the West Germans, the last of those three parliaments to vote, but arguably the most important, agreed to accept the Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles, the Soviet Union responded by walking out of those arms control talks in Geneva. It was a rapid transformation from there. In 4 years, we went from the Soviets walking out of the arms control talks to Reagan and Gorbachev signing a treaty banning an entire class of weapons. And I cannot overstate the degree to which that was a product, above all, of this man, Mikhail Gorbachev, his thinking, and his diplomacy. It was, for instance, Gorbachev in February of 1987 who was willing to untie the old Soviet arms control package and break the issue of the Euromissiles out of a deal that was also linked to the Strategic Defense Initiative, right? Star Wars, that great passion project of President Reagan. It was Gorbachev who was willing to accept a lopsided deal with clear US advantages. What the Soviet Union accepted in 1987 destroyed 1,000 more Soviet missiles than American missiles in the final agreement, and the Soviets agreed to a much more aggressive inspection regime than they had ever accepted in an arms control agreement before. The treaty also preserved key US technological advantages. The United States and the Soviet Union dismantled and destroyed every ground-based missile with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. That was both conventional and nuclear. But it left air and sea-launched capabilities untouched, places where the United States had a decisive technological advantage over the Soviet Union. And if we think about the way the United States fought many of its military campaigns in the 1990s, they would have looked a lot different without air and sea-launched cruise missiles. Now, we might think the story ends here, right, with Reagan and Gorbachev signing the treaty in Washington. But the aftermath of this treaty, I show, caused a whole new round of angst within the alliance, as they once again faced familiar difficulties about how credible extended deterrence could be, this time if you removed the Euromissiles, right, those Glickums and Pershing IIs. And this coincided with a debate over whether or not to modernize the weapons left outside the treaty, right? Those short-range nuclear forces, or SNF, with a range under 500 kilometers. They happened through a sort of, just the clock of how long a nuclear weapon can stay in service to be due for modernization. And that caused particular problems in the Federal Republic of Germany, where, again, right, think about our map of Europe. If a missile has a range under 500 kilometers in Cold War Europe, NATO needs to station it almost certainly in West Germany for it to be effective. And so this drew attention to nearly all of the uncomfortable West German position as a state in a divided nation straddling the front lines of the Cold War. Germans handled this with a maybe characteristic morbid sense of humor, with the slogan, the shorter the range, the deader the German. But don't worry, it's okay to laugh there. I always have this reaction that people are like, I don't know if that's funny or uncomfortable. It's a little bit of both. Right? But West German opposition to modernization caused a lot of frustration for other Western European leaders, like Margaret Thatcher, who were increasingly convinced that the West Germans now had an outsized role in NATO's decision-making. Thatcher, for instance, worried that a swell of popular opposition and deft diplomacy on the part of Mikhail Gorbachev would leave the Allies exposed, pressured to accept another zero option, right? Getting rid of another class of nuclear weapons, as they had just done with the INF Treaty, and that they would be forced to accept a third zero. For Thatcher, this meant terrible things for Allied strategy. She feared it would mean the denuclearization of Europe, the unraveling of NATO's deterrent, and with it, the foundations of peace in the continent. And so even in 1989, there are very real concerns about the durability of the alliance's policies. The earlier deliberations and debates and protests had fractured much of the security consensus in the alliance. And many wondered if NATO could genuinely still maintain a posture based on the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. It was a question that ended up swept away with the Berlin Wall and with communist regimes across Central and Eastern Europe. But that sense of fragility, whether the still fresh debates over modernizing short-range nuclear forces or the scars of the earlier difficulties of the 1970s and 1980s, lingered for policymakers. And I think against that backdrop, it's not difficult for us to see why so many Allied officials, not just Americans, were eager to see NATO play a vital and continued role in the emerging post-Cold War order. By way of conclusion, I want to flag just 3 central takeaways. The first is that for anyone familiar with this subject, you might notice that I have not yet used the popular shorthand for it, the Euromissiles crisis. And there's a reason for that. Because quite simply, I think that shorthand paradoxically flattens what happened and downplays its significance. There was no single crisis over the Euromissiles. There were many. That leads me to a second point. The Euromissiles threatened the very fundamental fabric and heart of the Atlantic Alliance. It was an issue that called into question the very fundamentals of the bargain struck in the late 1940s. It raised doubts about the US role in Europe, what role it could and should play. It raised doubts about the place that the Federal Republic of Germany occupied in the European state system and how much power a successor to Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany should actually play in the continent. It caused widespread debate about Soviet intentions and whether or not the Soviet Union really posed a threat anymore in the late Cold War. And of course, it raised fundamental, incredibly difficult questions about whether or not it was responsible to rely on nuclear weapons for one's defense and security. The story I tell in the book is one that sheds light on how precisely the things that made NATO strong were also the things that left it vulnerable, fragile, and exposed. The last point I want to make, taking us up to the present, is a classic historian's reminder. It is all too tempting, I think, to look back at the history of the Euromissiles and see a perfect arc and assume that it was an unmitigated success in policy terms. Telling that neat, clean narrative arc, right? You build up to build down, you escalate to de-escalate, gives people confidence that somehow we can repeat the same success over again. The story I tell should give those people pause. The Cold War was not guaranteed to end the way that it did without nuclear conflict in Europe or with NATO fully intact. And as those events and this history recede into the past, often forgotten, I think we would do well to remember how easily it might have turned out another way. Thanks, I'll leave it there.